The gavel fell with the sound of a bone breaking, a sharp, final crack that echoed the fracture in Lena's own life. Across the sterile courtroom, her ex-husband, Mark, allowed a small, satisfied smirk to ghost across his lips. It was a victor's smile, thin and cruel. He got the house, the savings, the business they had built together from whispered dreams in a cramped apartment. He got the future. Lena got the bridge. The judge, a man with tired eyes and a voice like rustling paper, had read the asset description with a faint, almost imperceptible note of pitying amusement. Item 7. The old Miller's Creek Covered Bridge, deed and title, located at the edge of the township, current assessed value, $1. It was a joke, a final public humiliation designed by Mark and his silver-tongued lawyer to leave her not just with nothing, but with a monument to her own ruin, a rotting, condemned piece of local folklore that the town had been trying to tear down for a decade. The weight of the moment was a physical pressure, pressing the air from her lungs, and in that suffocating silence, the laughter of Mark's new life seemed to ring in her ears. If you believe in second chances, that a foundation thought to be worthless can hold an unexpected treasure, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now back to the crushing silence of Lena's new reality. She didn't look at Mark again. Instead, her gaze drifted to the tall, grimy window, to a sky the color of dishwater. She felt the weight of the other people in the room, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The single black mother, cast aside for a younger, wealthier model, now the proud owner of a pile of rotting timber over a muddy creek. She signed the papers with a hand that didn't feel like her own, the cheap pen slick with sweat. Her lawyer, a public defender who had looked exhausted from the moment they met, gave her a weak, apologetic shrug. It's over, Lena. You're free. But she didn't feel free. She felt anchored to a failure so immense it had a physical location, a name on a deed. Outside, the air was damp and smelled of impending rain. She found her 7-year-old daughter, Maya, waiting on a bench with a social worker, her small face tight with a worry that no child should ever have to carry. Maya's backpack, filled with a coloring book and a half-eaten bag of pretzels, sat beside her like a tiny suitcase. "Is it done, Mommy?" Maya asked, her voice small. Lena forced a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. "It's done, sweetie. We can go home now." Home. The word tasted like ash. It wasn't their home anymore. It was a small, 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat where the smell of bleach and damp clothes clung to the curtains and the rumble of the dryers was a constant, mournful hum. The drive was silent. Maya seemed to understand that the quiet was a fragile thing, not to be broken. Lena drove on autopilot, her knuckles white on the steering wheel of her aging sedan. But instead of turning toward the apartment, she found herself taking the old county road, the one that led out of town, past the shuttered textile mill and the forgotten farms. "Where are we going?" Maya asked, finally breaking the silence. "I want to see it," Lena said, the words surprising even herself. "I want to see my bridge." The road narrowed, the asphalt crumbling into gravel. The trees grew thicker here, their branches weaving a dense canopy that starved the light. And then, there it was, the old Miller's Creek Covered Bridge. It was worse than she had imagined. It was a skeletal thing, a relic from another time. The red paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood a mottled, leprous gray. Boards were missing from its sides like knocked-out teeth, and the roof sagged in the middle, a broken spine. A heavy chain was slung between 2 concrete barriers at its entrance, adorned with a rusted sign that read, "Condemned Danger. Do not enter." It spanned a sluggish brown creek, connecting 2 overgrown patches of forgotten land. It served no purpose. It went from nowhere to nowhere. It was, in every conceivable way, worthless. Lena got out of the car, the gravel crunching under her worn sneakers. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of wet earth and rotting wood. She walked to the barrier, her hand resting on the cold, rough chain. This was it. This was the sum of her life with Mark. A dead end. A collapsing structure that nobody wanted. Maya came to stand beside her, her small hand slipping into Lena's. "It's big," she whispered, her voice filled not with disappointment, but with a child's simple awe. Lena looked down at her daughter, at her wet arm, innocent eyes and felt a fresh wave of despair wash over her. What had she done to deserve this? What kind of future could she possibly build for this beautiful, trusting child from the wreckage of her past? She looked back at the bridge. It stood silent and defiant against the darkening sky, a monument not just to her ruin, but to a stubborn, inexplicable endurance. It was still standing. After all the storms, the floods, the neglect, it was still here. A flicker of something. Not hope, but a hard, cold defiance stirred in her chest. Mark thought he had buried her under the weight of this rotting wood. He thought this would be her tombstone. He was wrong. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She didn't know how or why, but she felt it in her bones, a certainty as deep and cold as the creek water flowing silently beneath the condemned timbers. This bridge was hers, and she would not let it fall. The days that followed the verdict bled into one another, a monotonous gray landscape of packing boxes and quiet tears. Lena moved through the life she once knew like a ghost, collecting the fragments Mark had allowed her to keep. Worn photo albums, Maya's crayon drawings from the refrigerator door, a chipped coffee mug that said, "World's Best Mom." Each object was a small, painful reminder of a reality that had been dismantled. The apartment above the laundromat was a constant assault on the senses. The rhythmic thumping of the machines below was the building's mechanical heartbeat, a sound that vibrated up through the floorboards and into her bones, making sleep a shallow, restless affair. But amid the despair, the image of the bridge remained, lodged in her mind like a stubborn splinter. It was her problem, her burden, her $1 catastrophe, and for that very reason, she couldn't let it go. One Saturday morning, while Maya was at a friend's birthday party, Lena found herself driving back out the old county road. This time, she wasn't a spectator to her own humiliation. She was an owner, however reluctant, coming to inspect her property. She parked the car and approached the bridge with a new sense of purpose. She brought a flashlight, work gloves, and a small crowbar she'd found in the trunk of her car. She ducked under the chain, ignoring the faded warnings on the sign. The entrance to the bridge was like the mouth of a cave, dark and foreboding. The floorboards, thick, heavy planks of oak, groaned under her weight. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the walls, creating shifting bars of light and shadow across the dusty floor. The air inside was still and heavy, smelling of time itself, of dry rot, pigeon droppings, and the faint, earthy scent of the creek below. She ran her flashlight beam over the interior. The walls were a lattice of heavy timbers, a complex geometry of trusses and supports that spoke of a craftsmanship long since vanished from the world. Generations of local teenagers had left their mark here. Declarations of love, crude drawings, names and dates carved into the wood. JD plus KB forever. Class of '88 rules. It was a history book of forgotten heartbreaks and fleeting triumphs. She walked the length of the bridge slowly, testing each step. The structure felt surprisingly solid under her feet, despite the sagging roof and the missing boards. The main beams were massive, cut from trees that must have been ancient when they were felled. There was a power to this place, a quiet dignity that defied its state of decay. It had been built to last. It had been built with a purpose that seemed to transcend its simple function of crossing a creek. At the far end, where the bridge met the opposite bank, the foundation was different. On the entrance side, the bridge rested on a modern-looking concrete abutment, likely a repair from decades ago. But here it was anchored to a massive structure of hand-cut, intricately fitted stones. It was a masterpiece of old-world masonry, a fortress designed to withstand 1,000 floods. Lena knelt, running her gloved hand over the cool, moss-covered stones. They were huge, perfectly square, and fit together with barely a sliver of space between them. It was here that she saw it. Near the bottom, almost hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes, was a single stone that was different from the rest. While the others were a uniform gray granite, this one was a darker, almost black basalt. And it wasn't perfectly square. One edge seemed almost beveled, and the mortar around it was a different color, a crumbling, sandy texture compared to the iron-hard mortar sealing the other stones. Her heart gave a little thump. It was probably nothing. A repair, a replacement, a quirk of the original construction. But it was an anomaly, an imperfection in a design that was otherwise flawless. She pushed aside the thorny branches, wincing as they scratched her arms. She leaned in closer, shining the flashlight into the thin gap around the stone. The beam was swallowed by darkness. There was a space behind it, a hollow. She pressed her hands against the stone. It was cold and immovable. She tried to find a purchase with her fingers, to wiggle it, but it was set as solid as the day it was laid. That's when she remembered the crowbar. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved it. This was ridiculous. She was a single mother with bills to pay and a child to raise, and she was out here trying to pry a rock from a condemned bridge in the middle of nowhere. It was a fool's errand born of desperation. She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the crumbling mortar at the top of the stone. She leaned into it, putting her whole body weight behind the effort. The metal scraped against the stone with a grating screech. Nothing happened. She tried again, aiming for a different spot, sweat beading on her forehead. The silence of the woods pressed in on her, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the chirping of unseen birds. It was hopeless. She was about to give up, to dismiss it as a fantasy, when she heard it. A faint, low groan, not from the crowbar, but from the stone itself. She repositioned the tool, finding a better angle, a deeper purchase. She pulled down with every ounce of strength she possessed. There was a loud crack, the sound of a seal breaking after a century of silence. The stone shifted, tilting inward just a fraction of an inch. A puff of stale, musty air escaped from the opening, a smell like a long, unopened tomb. Hope, sharp and terrifying, surged through her. She worked the crowbar furiously now, chipping away at the old mortar, leveraging the stone inch by painful inch. It was heavy, a solid block of rock that fought her every step of the way. Finally, with a deep, grinding scrape, the stone tilted far enough for her to get her hands around it. She pulled. It slid out of its socket and toppled onto the muddy ground with a heavy thud. Lena fell back, breathing heavily, her hands scraped and raw. For her was a dark, perfectly square opening, a maw leading into the heart of the bridge's foundation. The darkness within was absolute, a void that seemed to drink the light from her flashlight. It wasn't a repair, it wasn't a quirk. It was a door, a secret door, hidden in plain sight for who knew how long. And she had just opened it. The fear was a living thing, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get back in her car, drive away, and pretend she had never found this place. This was trespassing on more than just condemned property. It was intruding upon a secret that had been deliberately and carefully buried. But something else held her there, a force stronger than the fear. It was the desperate, clawing need for a different answer, a different path from the one laid out for her. It was the refusal to accept that a $1 bridge was the final word on her life. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the musty air from the opening filling her lungs. She aimed her flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut a clean, white circle through the black, revealing not a dirt-filled hole, but the beginning of a narrow, stone-lined passage. It was man-made. The walls were smooth, the floor was paved with flat stones. It was a tunnel leading down into the earth beneath the bridge. Her mind raced. A smuggler's cache? A forgotten cellar from an old homestead? Her imagination, fueled by a lifetime of movies and novels, supplied a dozen wild theories, each more unlikely than the last. But the reality was simple. She would never know unless she went inside. She hesitated for a long moment, her hand gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles ached. She thought of Maya, of her trusting face. Was this a reckless risk, or was it the only chance she had? With a resolve that felt borrowed from someone braver than herself, she squeezed through the opening. The space was tight, the stones cold and damp against her clothes. The air grew colder as she moved forward, thick with the smell of subterranean earth and something else, something dry and papery, like an old book. The passage sloped downward for about 10 feet and then opened into a small chamber. It was no bigger than a walk-in closet, a perfect cube of fitted stone. The engineering was remarkable. The ceiling was a shallow, self-supporting arch, and there were no signs of collapse or water damage. It was as dry as a bone. Her flashlight beam swept across the small space, and her breath caught in her throat. The chamber was not empty. Lined up against the far wall were 3 large, dark wooden chests. They were bound with iron straps, rusted but intact. They weren't treasure chests from a pirate movie. They were simple, brutally functional footlockers, built for storage and transport, not for decoration. They were old, but they had been protected from the elements in this stone womb. Time had stood still in here. Lena approached them slowly, her footsteps echoing in the profound silence. This was it, the secret. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet dark. Kneeling before the first chest, she ran her fingers over the rough wood and the cold iron. There was a large, simple latch, but no lock. It was as if the stone door was considered security enough. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the latch. She fumbled with it for a moment before it finally gave way with a rusty squeal. She lifted the heavy lid. The flashlight beam fell upon the contents, and Lena felt a dizzying wave of disbelief. It wasn't gold coins or sparkling jewels. It was money. Stacks and stacks of it. Old currency, the bills larger than modern ones, wrapped in thick paper bands held together with wax seals. She reached in and lifted one of the bundles. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but still legible. They were United States notes, gold certificates, from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She saw denominations of $50, $100, even $500. There were thousands of them. She slowly lowered the bundle back into the chest, her mind struggling to process the scale of what she was seeing. She moved to the second chest. It was the same. More stacks of currency, neatly arranged, filling the container to the brim. And then the third. It too was filled with money, but on top of the bundles sat a single object wrapped in oilcloth, a thick, leather-bound journal. She sank back on her heels, the flashlight beam trembling, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. This wasn't a small stash of hidden cash. This was a fortune, a colossal, life-altering fortune. How much? She had no idea. It was an impossible amount to calculate, an abstraction of wealth that her mind, accustomed to calculating grocery bills and late fees, simply could not grasp. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to laugh, a hysterical bubbling sound that died in her throat. Mark, with his smug smile and his cruel joke. He had given her a rotting bridge worth $1. He had buried her, he thought, in a pile of worthless debris, and all along, buried deeper still, in the very foundation of that ruin, was this, a king's ransom, a secret kept for 100 years, waiting for her. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fear that was entirely different from the fear of entering the chamber. This was the fear of possession. This secret was a crushing weight. What could she possibly do? She couldn't just walk into a bank and deposit a 100-year-old fortune. Questions swirled in her mind, a chaotic storm of panic and confusion. Who put it here? Why, was it stolen? Was it legal? People would come looking for it. People would kill for it. She was no longer just a struggling single mother. She was the guardian of a dangerous, impossible secret. She carefully closed the lids of the chests, the sound echoing like a final judgment in the small chamber. She picked up the oilcloth-wrapped journal. It felt heavy in her hands, heavy with the answers she desperately needed. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her life had been irrevocably split into two parts, the life she had lived before opening that stone door and the life that would come after. The bridge was no longer a symbol of her failure. It was a vault, and she was its keeper. She backed out of the chamber, her movements clumsy and rushed. She wrestled the heavy basalt stone back into place, jamming it as tightly as she could into the opening. It wasn't perfect, but from a distance, it would look undisturbed. She kicked dirt and leaves over the base, trying to conceal the marks left by the crowbar. As she stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, she looked at the bridge, really looked at it for the first time. It was no longer just wood and stone. It was a promise. It was a tomb. It was a treasure chest. It was the most terrifying and wonderful thing she had ever seen. She clutched the journal to her chest and hurried back to her car, her mind a whirlwind of terror and awe. The drive back to the apartment was a blur. She had just discovered a fortune that could solve every problem she had, and yet she had never felt more trapped in her life. The apartment felt different when she returned. The familiar scent of bleach from the laundromat, The low rumble of the dryers, the faint sound of traffic from the street below. It was all the same, yet utterly alien. She had crossed a threshold into a new reality, but the world outside the bridge had not changed with her. It was a profoundly disorienting feeling, like living in two worlds at once. In one world, she was Lena, the single mom who carefully counted her change at the grocery store and worried about the gas bill. In the other, she was the silent keeper of an unimaginable fortune, a secret so vast it felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. She hid the journal at the bottom of her laundry hamper, beneath towels and old sheets, the safest place she could think of in the small apartment. For days, she did nothing. The knowledge of the money sat in her mind like a ticking bomb. Sleep offered no escape. Her dreams were filled with dark chambers, endless stacks of money, and the faceless, shadowy figures of those who might come looking for it. Every knock on the door sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Every siren in the distance made her heart pound. She was consumed by a paranoia that was as suffocating as it was logical. Who could she tell? The police? They would confiscate it, launch an investigation that would drag on for years, and she would likely never see a dime. A lawyer? The moment she spoke the words, she would lose control, her secret becoming a case file, a matter of public record. She could tell no one. The secret had to be hers and hers alone. The irony was a bitter pill. She held the solution to all her financial woes, yet she still had to scrape together enough money to fix the leaky faucet in her bathroom. She still had to smile and nod when her landlord reminded her that rent was due on the 1st. The contrast was a form of psychological torture. She would sit with Maya at the dinner table, helping her with her homework, her mind a million miles away in a cold stone chamber, trying to calculate the incalculable. One evening as Maya slept, Lena retrieved the journal. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the oilcloth. The leather cover was worn smooth with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. The ink was a faded brown, the handwriting a beautiful looping cursive from another era. She opened it to the first page. "My name is Elias Vance, and this bridge is my testimony." The words seemed to lift off the page, imbued with a gravity that reached across the century. She began to read, and the world of her small, cramped apartment dissolved, replaced by the story of a man in a dream. Elias Vance was born a slave in Georgia. The journal began with his earliest memories, the heat, the back-breaking labor, and the small, secret moments of learning. An old, kind man on the plantation had taught him his letters by drawing in the dirt with a stick. Another had taught him numbers, the beautiful, clean logic of mathematics. Elias, it turned out, had a genius for it. He saw the world in terms of angles, stresses, and supports. He could look at a structure and understand its weaknesses, its strengths, how to make it better, stronger. After the emancipation, he made his way north, a free man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mind that burned with ambition. He worked on railroads, in foundries, and on construction sites, absorbing every bit of knowledge he could. He was a brilliant, self-taught engineer and architect in a world that was determined to see him only as a laborer. He eventually settled in the small, burgeoning town of Miller's Creek. The journal described the town as a place of tentative hope. A small community of freedmen and women had gathered there, buying up small parcels of land, building a church, a school, a life. They were carpenters, blacksmiths, farmers, and teachers. They were building their own world, separate but determined. Elias became their leader, their visionary. The town needed a reliable way to cross the creek, which often flooded, cutting them off from the main road to the city. The town council, made up of the established white landowners, refused to fund it. So Elias designed a bridge. The journal was filled with his sketches, intricate drawings of truss designs, calculations of load-bearing capacities, cross-sections of the stone foundations. It was the work of a master. But the bridge was more than a bridge. It was to be a statement. It would be built by black hands, with black ingenuity, a permanent, powerful symbol of their permanence and skill. It would be their gateway to the future, and it would be funded by them. The next section of the journal detailed the most astonishing part of the story. Elias and the leaders of his community began to pool their resources. They worked extra jobs, saved every spare penny. They invested wisely, guided by a shrewd blacksmith who had a knack for numbers. They formed a secret society, a cooperative bank. They were not just building a bridge, they were building an economic powerhouse. The money grew. It grew beyond their wildest dreams. Their goal was to use the fortune to buy up the entire valley, to build a new town, a self-sufficient, independent black township, with its own governance, its own industries, its own destiny. A place they would call sanctuary. The money in the chests was not stolen. It was earned. It was the seed of a nation, the dream of a people who had been denied everything. Lena had to put the journal down, her heart aching with the beauty and the tragedy of the story. She felt like a trespasser, an unworthy witness to such a profound and noble ambition. She looked around her tiny apartment, at the peeling paint and the second-hand furniture, and felt a deep, gut-wrenching shame. The money in that chamber was not a windfall. It was a trust. It was a legacy of hope, sacrifice, and unimaginable courage. The final pages of the journal were hurried, the elegant script devolving into a frantic scrawl. The tone shifted from one of hope to one of fear and betrayal. Their success had not gone unnoticed. The white landowners, the same ones who had refused to build the bridge, grew suspicious and jealous of the community's growing prosperity. They saw sanctuary not as a dream, but as a threat. The journal spoke of threats, of night riders, of a climate of growing terror. Elias and the others knew their dream was in danger. They had to hide the money, the fruit of their life's work. Elias had designed the foundation of his bridge for this very purpose. The secret chamber was not an afterthought. It was part of the original design, a hidden vault to protect their future. The last entry was dated October 12, 1889. They are coming for us tonight, we know it. Mr. Thorne and the others. They mean to burn us out, to scatter us to the winds and take the land. But they will not find our seed. The foundation will hold it. The bridge will keep its promise. One day someone of good heart will find this place. Do not use this for yourself. Use it to finish the work. Build sanctuary. Let the dream live. The foundation holds. Lena closed the journal, her hands trembling. Thorne, she knew that name. Thorne Development was the largest real estate company in the county. The Thorne family was one of the town's founding families. Their name on the library, the park, the oldest bank. The betrayal wasn't just a historical event. Its legacy was alive and well, and it owned half the town. She now understood the truth. She hadn't stumbled upon a treasure. She had been chosen. The $1 bridge wasn't a joke. It was a key. She was the inheritor not of a fortune but of a sacred duty, a 100-year-old promise. And the descendants of the men who had betrayed Elias Vance were the very people who now ran the town. The weight on her shoulders grew heavier, but it was no longer the crushing weight of a secret. It was the solid, empowering weight of purpose. The world outside the apartment door no longer seemed alien. It now looked like a battlefield, its lines of conflict drawn a century ago and invisible to all but her. The quiet, sleepy town of Millers Creek was, she now knew, built on a foundation of theft and violence. The Thorne family's legacy, celebrated on plaques and in local history books, was a lie. And she, Lena, the woman everyone saw as broken and defeated, was the only one who held the truth. The knowledge was a fire in her belly, burning away the last vestiges of her despair and replacing it with a cold, hard resolve. But what could she do? She was one person against a dynasty. The journal's command was clear. Build sanctuary. But how? The world of 1889 was gone. The valley was no longer empty land waiting to be bought. It was a patchwork of suburbs, strip malls, and the sprawling Thorne Estates luxury golf community. Before she could even begin to contemplate that monumental task, a more immediate threat emerged. A certified letter arrived in her flimsy apartment mailbox, the crisp, cream-colored envelope bearing the official seal of the Millers Creek Township. Her hands were unsteady as she tore it open. It was a notice of public hearing. The town council, in partnership with Thorne Development, was officially moving forward with a proposal for Urban Renewal and Beautification Project 7B. The project's centerpiece was the immediate demolition of the hazardous and derelict Old Millers Creek-covered bridge to make way for the construction of an access road to a new luxury condominium complex. The hearing was in 2 weeks. A cold dread washed over her. It was happening. The descendants of the men who had burned out Elias Vance's community were now coming to finish the job, to destroy the last remnant of his legacy, ignorant of the treasure it protected. Or were they? A paranoid thought flickered in her mind. Could they possibly know? Was this all a complicated scheme to get to the money? No, that was impossible. The secret had been kept for over a century. This was just greed, plain and simple, a modern-day echo of the same avarice that had destroyed Sanctuary before it was ever built. Thorne wanted the land. The bridge was in his way. It was that simple and that terrifying. Lena knew she couldn't fight them alone. The journal had given her a purpose, but it hadn't given her a plan. She needed help. She needed knowledge. She thought of the town's small historical society, a dusty, underfunded room in the back of the public library. She remembered seeing a name in the local paper, an old man who was always writing letters to the editor, lamenting the destruction of historic buildings. His name was Arthur Abernathy. She found him there the next afternoon, a man who seemed as ancient and dusty as the artifacts he curated. He was thin and stooped, with a shock of white hair and thick glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. He was meticulously cataloging old photographs, his long, bony fingers handling the fragile prints with a surgeon's care. "Mr. Abernathy?" Lena began, her voice hesitant. He looked up, his expression one of mild surprise, as if he weren't used to having visitors. "Yes? Can I help you?" "My name is Lena Washington. I'm the new owner of the old Miller's Creek covered bridge." His eyebrows shot up above the rim of his glasses. A slow smile spread across his wrinkled face. "Ah, yes. The spoils of war, I heard. I'm sorry for your troubles, Mrs. Washington, but I must confess I was glad to hear someone had taken possession of it. I was afraid it would revert to the town, and we know what that means." He gestured to a pile of papers on his desk. It was the public hearing notice. "Indeed," Lena said, her heart lifting slightly. She had found an ally. "They want to tear it down." "They've wanted to tear it down for 50 years, Abernathy said, his voice laced with a weary cynicism. "It's an eyesore, they say, a liability. What they mean is it's old, it's not making anyone money, and it's in the way of Mr. Daniel Thorne's next glorious monument to bad taste." He peered at her over his glasses, his gaze sharp and intelligent. "But you're not here to complain. You're here because you want to stop them. Why?" It was the critical question. Lena couldn't tell him the whole truth. She couldn't speak of the chamber, the money, or the journal, but she could tell him a part of it. "Because it's mine," she said, the words simple but filled with a conviction that surprised her. "Because it's important. It's a piece of history. It shouldn't be destroyed." Abernathy studied her for a long moment, a flicker of something, respect perhaps, in his eyes. "It is more important than you know," he said quietly, his voice dropping. He stood and beckoned her to follow him to a large, flat file cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled open a wide drawer and carefully lifted out a massive, hand-drawn map of the area, yellowed with age. "This is the original surveyor's map of the county, from 1895, he said, spreading it on a table. "Look here," he pointed to the area around the bridge. The map was sparsely populated, with large tracts of land labeled with family names: Thorne, Miller, Cartwright. But there was another community marked on the map, a cluster of small properties on the wrong side of the creek. The area was labeled Freedman's Hollow. "There was a thriving black community here once," Abernathy said, his finger tracing the faint lines. "Started right after the Civil War. They had a church, a school, several businesses. They were doing quite well for themselves. And then one day, they were just gone." "What happened to them?" Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper, though she already knew the answer. "The official story is that there was a fire, a terrible accident. It swept through the settlement and the people just moved on, dispersed. But I've never believed it." He looked at her, his pale eyes intense. "There are stories, whispers, that the fire wasn't an accident, that the community was getting too successful, too uppity for the likes of the Thorne family and the other big landowners, that they were driven out." He sighed, a sound of deep, abiding frustration. "But it's just folklore. There's no proof. The town records from that year conveniently disappeared. The newspaper archives have a gap. The story was erased. Lena stared at the map, at the ghost of a community she now knew was meant to be called Sanctuary. Elias Vance. Freedman's Hollow. Mr. Abernathy didn't have the proof, but she did. It was sitting at the bottom of her laundry hamper. The bridge was built before the fire, wasn't it? She asked. By whom? Oh, that's the most interesting part, Abernathy said, a spark of excitement in his voice. It wasn't built by the town. It was built by the residents of Freedman's Hollow themselves. The lead engineer was a man of pure genius, a former slave named Elias Vance. He designed it and supervised its construction. It's a masterpiece. The stonework on that foundation is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's a monument to a community that this town has tried its best to forget. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The two halves of the story, hers and his, were clicking into place, forming a single, terrible narrative. Can we save it? She asked. Can we stop them? Arthur Abernathy looked from the map to Lena's determined face. He saw not a defeated woman, but a fighter. It will be a battle, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. Thorne has the money and the council in his pocket. But we have the truth, and now, Mrs. Washington, thanks to you, the bridge has a champion. Let's give them a fight they'll never forget. In that dusty room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, a partnership was forged. The old historian who had spent his life searching for a story that had been erased, and the young mother who had just been handed its final, explosive chapter. The alliance with Arthur Abernathy gave Lena a foothold in a world she didn't understand. He was a walking encyclopedia of local history, but more importantly, he knew the bureaucratic labyrinth of town ordinances, historical preservation laws, and public records. He was the strategist. She was the secret weapon, the keeper of the one piece of evidence that could change everything. They met in the evenings at the Historical Society, long after it had closed to the public. The dusty room became their war room. Surrounded by faded maps and forgotten artifacts, they pieced together a plan. Their first step was to delay the demolition. Abernathy knew of a state law that allowed any citizen to petition for a historical review of a structure over 50 years old, a move that would trigger an automatic stay on any demolition permits until the review was complete. It was a temporary measure, a bit of legal sand in the gears of Thorne's machine, but it would buy them time. We need to prove the bridge's significance, Abernathy explained, his finger tracing a line in a thick legal book. Not just its age, but its connection to a significant historical event or person. We need to prove that Elias Vance was a figure of historical importance. He was, Lena said, the journal's story burning in her memory. He was more than important. He was a visionary. Over the next week, they worked tirelessly. Abernathy dug through old county archives, tax records, and census data, searching for any official mention of Elias Vance or Freedman's Hollow. Lena, guided by the names and dates in the journal, began a different kind of search. She spent hours online navigating genealogical websites and digital archives of historical Black newspapers. The journal was her roadmap. It mentioned families who had been part of the secret cooperative, the Carvers, who were blacksmiths, the Stantons, who were teachers, the Dubois family, who ran a small freight business. She searched for those names, looking for any descendants who might still be alive, who might carry a piece of the story passed down through generations. It was painstaking work. The trail was more than a century old, cold and faint. But she found whispers, a census record from 1910 listing a Samuel Carver, son of a blacksmith living in Chicago. A brief mention in a 1920s edition of the Chicago Defender of a community church founded by a Reverend Stanton, formerly of Miller's Creek. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was proof that the community hadn't just vanished. They had survived. Meanwhile, Abernathy made a breakthrough of his own. Buried deep in the county land registry, misfiled under a different township, he found the original incorporation papers for the Sanctuary Cooperative Association, dated 1887. The list of founding members read like a roll call from Elias Vance's journal, and the association's stated purpose was the acquisition of land and the establishment of a self-sufficient community for the economic and social advancement of its members. It was the smoking gun. They won't be able to call it folklore anymore, Abernathy said. his voice trembling with excitement as he held the fragile document. This is proof. This was real. The historical review petition, citing the discovery of the Sanctuary Cooperative and the significance of Elias Vance as its visionary leader, was filed at the town hall. As expected, it caused an immediate and angry reaction from Daniel Thorne. He issued a statement to the local paper decrying the frivolous and obstructionist tactics that were delaying a vital economic development project. He painted Lena and Abernathy as sentimental fools, clinging to a pile of rotting wood at the expense of progress. The battle lines were drawn. The town began to take sides. Some older residents sided with Abernathy, remembering stories their grandparents had told about the other side of the creek. But most people, eager for the bees and most tax revenue the condo project promised, saw Lena as a nuisance, the bitter ex-wife who was now taking her frustrations out on the whole town. Her ex-husband, Mark, certainly saw it that way. He called her one evening, his voice dripping with condescending disbelief. "What are you doing, Lena? I heard you're trying to save that piece of junk. Are you trying to embarrass me?" "This has nothing to do with you, Mark," she said, her voice steady and cold. "It's my property. I'll do what I want with it." "Your property? It's a pile of splinters I got stuck with. The only reason you have it is because I let you. I could have had it condemned and torn down years ago. Take the money Thorne is offering and walk away. Don't be a fool." His words were meant to sting, to remind her of her powerlessness, but they had the opposite effect. They fanned the flames of her resolve. She was not the woman he had divorced. She was not powerless. She was the guardian of a legacy he couldn't possibly comprehend. "I'm not selling," she said, and hung up. The conversation left her shaken, but also strangely liberated. The last tie to her old life, the need for Mark's approval or the fear of his disapproval, was severed. Her fight was not about him. It was about Elias. It was about Sanctuary. A few days later, a long black car pulled up in front of her apartment building. A man in an expensive suit got out. It was Daniel Thorne. He didn't bother using the buzzer. He waited by his car, a clear signal that he expected her to come down to him. Lena watched him from her window for a full minute, her heart pounding. Then she took a deep breath, walked downstairs, and met him on the sidewalk, forcing him to stand on her turf. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his smile smooth and practiced. He was handsome in a predatory way, with silver hair and a deep tan. "Daniel Thorne, thought we might have a chat, clear the air." "There's nothing to clear," Lena said. "It's all in the public record." "Look," he said, his smile tightening slightly, "I admire your passion. I do. But let's be realistic. That bridge is a relic. It's unsafe. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer, far more than it's worth, to compensate you for your trouble. Let's say $50,000, cash. You and your daughter could have a fresh start." $50,000. 6 months ago, that amount of money would have been a miracle, a lifeline that would have solved everything. Now it was an insult. It was a pittance offered by the descendant of a thief to the guardian of a fortune. She thought of the stacks of currency in the stone chamber, of the dreams they represented. She looked at this man, at his expensive suit and his confident smirk, and she saw the ghost of his ancestor, the man who had led the Night Riders. "The bridge is not for sale, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. His smile vanished. His eyes turned cold. "You are making a mistake," he said, the words a clear threat. "You are standing in the way of progress. And people who stand in the way of progress in this town tend to get run over." He got back in his car and sped away, leaving Lena standing on the sidewalk, the smell of exhaust fumes in the air. The threat was real. Thorne was not a man who was used to being told no. The fight was no longer about petitions and historical records. It had become personal. It was a continuation of a conflict that had begun over a century ago on the banks of the same muddy creek. And Lena knew with chilling certainty that Thorne would not stop at public statements and veiled threats. He would come for her. He would come for the bridge. The threat from Daniel Thorne hung in the air, a palpable tension that followed Lena Mao everywhere. She felt watched. Cars she didn't recognize seemed to slow down as they passed her apartment building. She started varying her routes to and from Maya's school, her eyes constantly scanning for the long black car. The pressure was immense, a constant grinding weight on her soul. Thorne's company, as promised, began to run people over, metaphorically speaking. They launched a public relations campaign, taking out full-page ads in the local paper filled with artist renderings of the beautiful new condominiums, complete with smiling, happy families. The ads spoke of job creation, increased property values, and a brighter future for Miller's Creek. The bridge, in their narrative, was a dangerous relic of the past, an obstacle to prosperity. Public opinion, already leaning in Thorne's favor, solidified against her. People whispered about her in the grocery store. A parent at Maya's school made a snide comment about her being a troublemaker. She was being isolated, painted as the enemy of the town she was secretly fighting to redeem. The temptation to give up, to take the money and run, became a seductive whisper in the back of her mind. It was strongest late at night when Maya was asleep and the apartment was quiet. She would take out the journal and read Elias Vance's words, and then think of the fortune sitting in the dark. What was she doing? She was a single mother with no resources, fighting a millionaire. She could take a fraction of that money, just a small fraction, and disappear. She and Maya could start a new life somewhere else, somewhere no one knew their names, somewhere safe. She could buy a house, a real house with a yard. She could send Maya to the best schools. She could give her daughter the life of security and privilege that had been stolen from her. Who would know? Elias Vance was long dead. His community was scattered. Who was she fighting for? The ghosts of people she'd never met? The dream of a town that never was? The temptation was a sickness, a fever in her blood. She walked through her days in a daze, torn between the sacred duties she had inherited and the fierce primal need to protect her child and herself. The $1 bridge had become a $1 cage. One afternoon, she drove out to the bridge, needing to reconnect with the source of her conviction. She walked its length, the familiar groan of the floorboards a comforting sound. She stood at the far end, looking at the massive stone foundation, at the one dark stone that was the key to everything. She placed her hand on it, feeling the cold, solid reality of it beneath her palm. The foundation holds, Elias had written. It was more than a statement about engineering. It was a statement of faith. He had entrusted his people's future to this structure, believing that it would endure, that its secret would be kept, that its promise would one day be fulfilled. Could she be the one to break that faith? To take the seed corn and use it to feed only herself? She thought of Maya. What kind of lesson would that be? That when things get hard, you take the easy way out, that principles are for sale, that a promise, even one a century old, means nothing in the face of fear and greed. She wanted to build a future for her daughter, yes, but what kind of future would it be if it was built on a foundation of broken trust? She would not be leaving her a legacy of wealth. She would be leaving her a legacy of theft. In that moment, standing in the dappled light filtering through the bridge's missing slats, her moral crisis resolved itself. The fever broke. The temptation receded, leaving behind a clean, cold clarity. She was not the owner of the money. She was its custodian. Her purpose was not to enrich herself, but to honor the sacrifice of those who came before her. She would not run, she would fight, and she would win. She returned to the apartment with a renewed sense of purpose, a warrior spirit she never knew she possessed. The next phase of the battle required a different kind of weapon. It required money. She made a decision that was both terrifying and necessary. She would have to return to the chamber. She waited for a moonless night, the darkness a welcome cloak. After putting Maya to bed, she drove out to the bridge, her car's headlights off as she turned down the final stretch of gravel road. The woods were unnervingly silent. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like an approaching threat. She worked quickly, her movements practiced now. She pried the stone loose and slipped into the chamber. The air was just as cold, just as still. She opened one of the chests and took out a single bundle of currency. It felt like sacrilege, like stealing from a church. She took one more, her heart pounding. It was enough, more than enough. She sealed the chamber and concealed the entrance as best she could in the dark. Back in the relative safety of her car, she looked at the money. It was real. It was hers to command. The next morning, she made a phone call. Not to a local lawyer, but to a prestigious firm in the city, a firm that specialized in historical preservation and land use law. She had found their name during her research. They had a reputation for taking on powerful developers and winning. "My name is Lena Washington," she said to the high-powered attorney on the other end of the line. "I am in a dispute with Thorn Development over a historically significant property, and I can pay your retainer in cash." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Then tell me everything." She also hired a renowned structural engineering firm, one with impeccable credentials. She didn't tell them about the chamber. She simply commissioned a full, independent assessment of the bridge's structural integrity. She knew what Elias Vance had written about his own work. She was betting his genius would stand up to modern scrutiny. The pieces were moving. The custodian of the fortune was finally putting it to work, using the seed to plow the field. The final piece of her plan involved her ex-husband. Mark's suspicion had been growing. He couldn't understand why she was fighting so hard, why she was turning down Thorne's money. His greedy mind could only arrive at one conclusion. There was something about the bridge he didn't know, something valuable. He started showing up at her apartment unannounced, trying to intimidate her, to wheedle the secret out of her. "What is it, Lena?" he demanded one evening, blocking her doorway. "Is there some kind of historical treasure hidden there? Antiques? Did you find something?" She looked at him, at the man she had once loved, and felt nothing but a profound pity. He was so small, his world defined only by what he could buy and sell. He could never understand what the bridge truly held. "You gave it to me, Mark," she said, her voice even. "You said it was worthless. You were wrong." She closed the door in his face, the click of the lock, a final, satisfying punctuation mark. His suspicion was a liability, but she realized it could also be an asset. He was predictable. His greed was a tool she could use. The stage was being set for the public hearing. Thorne thought it would be his coronation, the final rubber stamp on his victory. He had no idea that Lena was no longer fighting with the petitions and pleas. She was fighting with the full weight of a 100-year-old promise, and she was about to bring the foundation of his world crashing down. The night of the town hall meeting, the air was electric with anticipation. The main assembly room was packed, a standing room-only crowd that spilled out into the hallways. It was the biggest turnout for a council meeting in recent memory. On one side of the room sat Daniel Thorne and his team of lawyers and architects, their faces confident, their briefcases filled with glossy presentations. On the other side sat Lena, with Arthur Abernathy at her side. To the surprise of many, they were joined by a sharp, impeccably dressed woman from the city, Lena's new lawyer, Ms. Evelyn Reed, and a stoic-looking man, Dr. Alistair Finch, the lead engineer from the firm she had hired. The townspeople buzzed with speculation. The battle over the old bridge had become the town's central drama. Thorne began the proceedings. He was slick and persuasive, a master of public speaking. He spoke of progress, of the future, of the economic benefits his project would bring. He presented a slick video showing the dilapidated bridge dissolving into a shimmering image of the new condominiums. He spoke of safety concerns, citing a cursory inspection done by a town-paid engineer that declared the bridge a public hazard. He painted a picture of a town held hostage by the sentimental whims of one woman. "We cannot let our town's future be dictated by a misplaced attachment to a dangerous and useless relic," he concluded, to a round of applause from his supporters. Then it was Lena's turn. The mayor, a man clearly in Thorne's pocket, called her name with a dismissive air. "Miss Washington, do you or your representatives have anything to add before the council votes?" All eyes turned to her. She could feel the hostility from half the room, the weight of their judgment. But she also felt the steadying presence of Abernathy beside her, and the history she carried within her. She was no longer just Lena Washington, the divorced single mom. She was Elias Vance's messenger. Miss Reed stood up, her presence commanding immediate silence. "We do, Mr. Mayor," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "First, we would like to address the issue of the bridge's safety." She called Dr. Finch to the podium. He unrolled a series of complex structural diagrams and presented the findings of his firm's 2-week comprehensive analysis. "The report from the town's inspector is, to be blunt, inadequate and deeply flawed, Doctor," Finch stated, his voice a deep baritone that carried through the room. Our analysis, which included sonar scanning of the foundation and core sampling of the main timbers, has found that the old Millers Creek Bridge is, in fact, one of the most remarkably well-engineered structures of its era that I have ever had the privilege to examine. The timber is old-growth oak, incredibly dense and rot-resistant. The lattice truss design is a work of genius, and the stone foundation, he paused, looking directly at Thorne, is more solid than the foundation of this very building. The bridge is not a liability. It is a fortress. With minor, cost-effective repairs to the roof and decking, it could be certified to carry pedestrian traffic for another 100 years. A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne's primary argument, the issue of safety, had just been systematically dismantled by an unimpeachable expert. He shifted in his seat, his confident smile faltering. Next, Miss. Reed addressed the bridge's historical significance. She presented the incorporation papers for the Sanctuary Cooperative Association that Abernathy had found. She spoke of the thriving Freedmen's Hollow community, and she introduced the name of its leader to the official public record. The bridge was designed and built by Elias Vance, she announced, a brilliant, self-taught African-American engineer, a former slave who became a leader of his community. This bridge is not just a bridge, it is the last surviving creation of a visionary mind and a monument to a community this town has deliberately tried to erase from its history. Abernathy then stood to provide historical context, his voice filled with a lifetime of passion for his subject. He spoke of the whispers and folklore he had collected over the years, stories of a vibrant community and the suspicious fire that had destroyed it. The atmosphere in the room was changing. The narrative was shifting. The bridge was no longer just a pile of rotting wood. It was becoming a symbol. Finally, Lena stood up. She didn't go to the podium. She stood in her place, forcing the council and the crowd to look at her, not as a petitioner, but as an equal. She held a single leather-bound book in her hands. "I have listened to Mr. Thorne talk about the future," she began, her voice quiet but steady, every person in the room leaning forward to hear her. "But you cannot build a decent future on a rotten foundation. This town's foundation is built on a lie." She held up the journal. "This is the journal of Elias Vance." A collective gasp went through the room. Thorne's face went pale. He wrote this in the days and weeks leading up to the destruction of his community. He wrote about his dreams. He wrote about his work. And he wrote about his betrayal. She opened the journal, her hands no longer trembling. "I am not going to read you the whole thing, but I will read you the final entry." She read the words aloud, her voice ringing with the weight of a century of injustice. "They are coming for us tonight, we know it, Mr. Thorne and the others. They mean to burn us out, to scatter us to the winds and take the land. But they will not find our seed. The foundation will hold it." She looked directly at Daniel Thorne, whose face was now a mask of disbelief and rage. "The Thorne family didn't build this town," she said, her voice rising with power. "They took it. They built their legacy on the ashes of another man's dream. You talk about progress, Mr. Thorne. Your family's idea of progress was to destroy a community of people whose only crime was their success." She didn't mention the money. She didn't have to. The truth of the journal was explosive enough. She was revealing not a financial treasure, but a historical one. She was giving Millers Creek back its true history, whether it wanted it or not. "This bridge is not a relic," she declared, her voice resonating in the stunned silence. "It is a testimony. It is a promise. And as its current owner, I will not allow you to tear it down. I will not allow you to silence the voice of Elias Vance any longer. We will not be run over." She sat down. The silence in the room was absolute, profound. The story she had told was so powerful, so damning, that it sucked all the air out of the room. The mayor stammered, trying to regain control. Thorne's lawyers whispered furiously to him. But the damage was done. The narrative was shattered. The fight was no longer about a bridge. It was about the soul of the town itself. In the back of the room, unnoticed by most, Lena saw her ex-husband, Mark. He had come to watch her humiliation, but his face was a portrait of utter shock, his jaw slack. He was finally beginning to understand. He had given her a pile of rotting wood, a joke. He had no idea he had handed her a sword. The aftermath of the town hall meeting was a quiet explosion that sent shockwaves through Millers Creek. The local newspaper, which had been a mouthpiece for Thorne Development, ran a front-page story with the headline, "Bridges' Secret History Rocks Town." The article included quotes from Lena's speech, Dr. Finch's report, and the damning entry from Elias Vance's journal. For the first time, the official, sanitized version of the town's founding was publicly challenged by irrefutable evidence. Daniel Thorne was engulfed in a firestorm. He tried to dismiss the journal as a fabrication, a desperate stunt. But Lena, through her lawyer, announced that the journal would be submitted to independent experts for authentication of its age, ink, and paper. Thorne's denial sounded hollow and defensive. The story of the Sanctuary Cooperative and the betrayal by the town's founding fathers became the only topic of conversation in cafes, barbershops, and on front porches. The town was forced to look at itself in a new, unflattering mirror. The Thorne family name, once a symbol of prosperity and civic pride, was now tainted with the suspicion of theft and violence. The State Historical Commission, prompted by the public outcry and the evidence presented by Ms. Reed, fast-tracked the review of the bridge. Within weeks, they issued their ruling. The old Millers Creek covered bridge was officially designated a state historical landmark, protecting it from demolition in perpetuity. It was a complete and total victory. Thorne, facing a public relations nightmare and a town council that was rapidly distancing itself from him, formally withdrew his condominium proposal. His empire was not destroyed, but its moral foundation had been exposed as rotten. He became a more private figure, his name now whispered with a mixture of awe and contempt. For Lena, the victory was profound but also sobering. She had saved the bridge. She had exposed the truth. But Elias Vance's ultimate charge remained: build sanctuary. The money, the great secret, was still sitting in the cold stone chamber, waiting. Its purpose was not to win a legal battle, but to build a community. This was the next and most important phase of her mission. With the guidance of Ms. Reed and the historical knowledge of Arthur Abernathy, Lena began the complex process of creating a legal and financial structure to manage the fortune. They decided against simply revealing the money, a move that would have created a chaotic and unmanageable gold rush of claims and media attention. Instead, they would honor the spirit of Elias Vance's cooperative. Lena used another small portion of the funds to quietly purchase a derelict downtown building, one of the many that had been left to rot. She established a nonprofit organization, the Vance Sanctuary Foundation. Its board of directors consisted of Lena, Arthur Abernathy, and Ms. Reed. Their mission was simple and audacious: to use the resources entrusted to them to finish the work Elias Vance had started. The foundation's first public act was to announce a project to fully restore the old Millers Creek covered bridge and create a small park and historical exhibit at its entrance, telling the story of Elias Vance and the Freedmen's Hollow community. The project would be funded by an anonymous donation in honor of the town's reclaimed history. The announcement was met with overwhelming public support. The town, now grappling with its complicated past, was eager for a path toward reconciliation and healing. The restoration of the bridge became that path. The foundation's work didn't stop there. True to the journal's command, they began to build sanctuary in a modern form. They started a scholarship fund for underprivileged students in the county, a grant program for minority-owned small businesses, and a fund to purchase and refurbish affordable housing. They were not buying up the valley to create a separate town, but were instead weaving the principles of sanctuary, opportunity, self-sufficiency, and community into the existing fabric of Millers Creek. They were healing the town from the inside out. Lena's life was transformed. She moved out of the apartment above the laundromat and into a modest but comfortable house, bought with a salary she now drew as the foundation's executive director. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances, but the architect of her own and her community's future. She remained the sole keeper of the secret of the chamber. Only she knew the full extent of the fortune and its physical location. It was a burden she would always carry, a silent responsibility that grounded her even as her public role grew. One of her most difficult but necessary tasks was to continue the research she had started, to find the living descendants of the other families of Freedmen's Hollow. The foundation hired a team of genealogists and researchers. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to find them. The great-grandchildren of the Carvers, the Stantons, the Dubois family, scattered across the country. Lena began to contact them not to offer them a share of the money, but to offer them something far more valuable, their history. She invited them back to Miller's Creek to see the bridge their ancestors had built, to read their names on the new historical plaques, to become part of the living legacy of Sanctuary. The final scene of this chapter of her life took place a year after the town hall meeting on a crisp autumn afternoon. The restored bridge stood proud and strong, its new coat of red paint glowing in the sun. A dedication ceremony was being held. The park was filled with townspeople, a diverse crowd of old and new residents. Among them were several families, the descendants of Freedman's Hollow, who had come from all over the country to be there. Lena stood at the podium with Maya by her side. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, at the bridge spanning the creek, at the town that was slowly, painfully learning to embrace its full history. She was no longer the woman who had stood defeated in a courtroom. She was a leader, a builder, a keeper of a sacred promise. Her ex-husband, Mark, was there, standing at the edge of the crowd. He had lost everything, his reputation, his new relationship, much of his money in bad investments. He just stood there, watching her, his face a mixture of awe and regret. He looked like a ghost from a past she had long since left behind. Later, after the speeches and the applause, Lena walked with Maya onto the bridge. They stood in the middle, looking down at the slow-moving water of the creek. The new floorboards were solid and steady under their feet. Maya, now 8 years old, looked up at her mother. "You fixed it, Mommy." Lena smiled, her heart full. "We fixed it, sweetie." She ran her hand along the smooth, strong railing. The bridge was no longer a symbol of ruin or a dead end. It was a connection. It connected the past to the future, a broken promise to a fulfilled one, a forgotten community to a reborn one. It connected a mother and a daughter to a legacy of strength and resilience. She looked from the bridge to the town, then back to the solid stone foundations, visible at the water's edge. The foundation had held the dream. Now it was her job and her daughters and the town's to hold it too. The foundation holds.